She was diving straight into the freezing waters of the Chicago River. A young black girl, wearing nothing but a thin white dress shirt, plunging into the dark, violent currents to pull a dying man back to the surface. She didn't know it then, but she wasn't just saving a life. She was rescuing the cold-hearted CEO of Vance Enterprises. My name is Sam. I'm 55 years old, and after decades living in this city, you think you've seen it all. But Maya's story, it's different. It's a tale of corporate betrayal, greed, and a desperate fight for survival from the bottom up. She was an intern drowning in debt to save her little brother. He was a billionaire who had forgotten how to trust. When their worlds collided that night, everything changed. If this story caught your attention, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment down below. And if you want to hear how this web of lies unravels, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. The wind howling off Lake Michigan cut through the steel canyons of Chicago like a serrated blade. It was late autumn, the kind of bitter, unforgiving night where the city's neon reflections fractured on the surface of the freezing, ink-black river below. Enter Maya Jackson. Maya was 22, a young African-American woman whose petite frame was currently shivering violently against the biting chill. Her dark, natural curls were pulled back into a strict, no-nonsense bun at the nape of her neck, a style chosen entirely for efficiency rather than vanity. She possessed a striking face, high cheekbones, and deep, expressive brown eyes that carried a heavy weight far beyond her 22 years. The set of her jaw spoke of a life spent constantly fighting gravity. Tonight, her only armor against the Chicago wind was a thin, white dress shirt, the only one she owned that was crisp and professional enough for her internship at the towering glass monolith of Vance Enterprises. It was becoming threadbare at the cuffs, a silent testament to her relentless, impoverished reality. Maya wasn't just tired. She was a hollowed-out kind of exhausted. Her personality had been forged in the fires of absolute necessity. Once a girl who might have dreamed of a carefree youth, she had hardened into a pragmatic, fiercely independent survivor. The defining event of her life lay in a sterile hospital bed halfway across the city. Her 10-year-old brother, Leo, with his gap-toothed smile and a failing heart that ticked like a devastating time bomb. He desperately needed surgery, a procedure with a price tag that mocked the meager stipends of an intern and the tips from her upcoming night shift at a downtown diner. This crushing responsibility had stripped away her naivety, replacing it with a fierce, unwavering protective instinct. She didn't have time for fear. She didn't have time for self-pity, and she certainly didn't have time to stop. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders, her worn sneakers hitting the pavement of the bridge in a rhythmic, exhausted march. The bridge was practically deserted, the sensible citizens of Chicago having long since retreated indoors to the warmth of their apartments. The only sound was the traffic rushing on the highway in the distance, and the rhythmic lapping of the river below. Then a sudden noise shattered the low hum of the wind, a harsh, guttural shout. Maya froze, instinctively shrinking back into the deep shadows of the iron beams. Her heart hammered against her ribs. About 50 yards ahead, two silhouettes were locked in a frantic, violent dance against the thick iron railing of the bridge. One figure was noticeably larger, dominating the physical struggle, while the other seemed caught entirely off guard, desperately trying to push back and find his footing. Maya's breath hitched in her throat. Every survival instinct she had honed on the rougher streets of the South Side screamed at her to look away, to keep walking, to mind her own business. Getting involved in late-night violence was a luxury she could not afford, but her feet remained stubbornly rooted to the concrete. The struggle reached a sudden, terrifying climax. There was a heavy thud of bone against metal, a sharp cry that was instantly swallowed by the roaring wind, and then the larger figure shoved the other backward with brutal, calculated force. The victim went over the iron railing. He didn't even scream as he fell. There was only the agonizing, suspended silence of the drop, followed instantly by a violent, heavy splash as the black, churning waters of the Chicago River swallowed him whole. The attacker lingered at the railing for a mere split second, peering over the edge into the dark abyss, before turning and melting away into the shadows of the city streets, leaving no trace behind. Maya stood paralyzed for a fraction of a second. The river was a known death trap. The temperature alone would induce hypothermic shock within minutes, dragging even the most powerful Olympic swimmer down into the murky, freezing depths. She had Leo to think about. She had the diner shift starting in exactly 20 minutes. If she got involved, if she got arrested or hospitalized, she could lose her job, her internship, her brother's only lifeline. But as she stared at the rippling black water where the man had vanished, she didn't see a wealthy stranger. She just saw a life slipping away into the dark. The fierce protective instinct that kept her fighting every single day for Leo flared to life, overriding all logic and fear. Without thinking, without allowing the paralyzing mathematics of poverty to stop her, Maya threw off her thin coat and kicked off her worn sneakers. She scrambled up the cold iron railing, the wind whipping her white shirt around her like a frail flag, took a deep breath, and dove directly into the abyss. The impact was like hitting a solid wall of concrete. The freezing water instantly slammed the breath from her lungs, thousands of icy needles driving into her skin simultaneously. Complete, suffocating darkness enveloped her. The current was vicious and chaotic, pulling violently at her limbs, trying to drag her beneath the surface toward the riverbed. Panic clawed fiercely at her throat, a primal terror urging her to swim away, but she forced it down. She kicked her legs with everything she had, forcing her eyes open in the stinging, murky water, searching the shadows. She breached the surface, gasping desperately for the freezing air, spinning around in the chop. "Hey!" she screamed, her voice sounding incredibly small, instantly lost in the vastness of the windy night. "Where are you?" Nothing. Just the relentless black water slapping against the concrete pillars. She took another massive breath, ignoring the burning in her chest, and dove under again, her hands swept blindly through the freezing void. Just as her lungs began to scream for oxygen and her vision started to speckle with black dots, her fingers brushed against something solid. Fabric. An arm. She grabbed it with both hands. It was a heavy, dead weight. Using every single ounce of strength in her petite frame, Maya kicked furiously toward the surface. She broke through the water, hauling the man's head up into the air. He was completely unresponsive, a dead weight in her arms. Her white dress shirt was now thoroughly soaked, clinging tightly to her skin and offering absolutely zero protection against the lethal, biting cold. Come on," she gasped out loud, her teeth chattering so violently they ached. She locked her arm tightly around his broad chest, swimming backward toward the rocky concrete embankment situated under the bridge's arch. The current fought her every inch of the way, a relentless, invisible monster trying to reclaim its stolen prey. Her muscles screamed in pure agony, her vision spotting with total exhaustion. Just as she thought her arms would give out and she would go under with him, her foot finally struck the slimy, solid concrete of the riverbank. With a final guttural scream of effort, she dragged his heavy upper body onto the freezing stones. She collapsed beside him for a second, violently coughing up foul river water, her entire body convulsing with uncontrollable shivers. But as she looked over, the man wasn't breathing. Maya forced herself up onto her knees beside him. In the dim, sickly yellow light cast from a distant street lamp above, she finally got a clear look at the man she had just pulled from the grave. He was in his late 20s, clad in what was clearly a bespoke, incredibly expensive dark suit that now clung heavily and uselessly to his broad, muscular frame. Even unconscious, battered and soaked in river water, his face was striking. He had the sharp, aristocratic jawline of a man entirely accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed immediately. He had high, prominent cheekbones and a strong, straight nose. His dark, thick hair was plastered to his forehead. Blood seeped from a nasty, jagged gash on his temple, mixing with the dark river water running down the side of his face. This was Julian Vance. Though Maya didn't know his name yet, every inch of him screamed of wealth and power. Julian was a man whose personality was as cold, deep, and unforgiving as the river he had just been pulled from. Raised in a cutthroat, highly competitive corporate empire, Julian had learned from a very young age that trust was a massive liability and empathy was a fatal weakness. He was a notoriously ruthless CEO, highly calculating and deeply isolated. His humanity and warmth had long been buried under thick layers of unimaginable wealth, constant suspicion, and corporate warfare. But right now, Maya didn't care about his expensive suit, his sharp jawline, or the empire he ruled. She only saw a heart that had stopped beating. She placed her trembling, freezing hands on his chest, directly over his heart, locked her elbows, and began chest compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Breathe," she begged, her wet hair falling completely out of its neat bun, the dark curls pasting to her cold cheeks. "Please, just breathe." She pinched his nose, tipped his head back, and breathed into his mouth. The metallic taste of fresh blood and the foul, murky stench of the river filled her senses. She immediately went back to compressions, pushing down hard. Her arms felt like solid lead, her own heart hammering dangerously fast, but she absolutely refused to stop. The frantic rhythm of her compressions matched the desperate, constant ticking of the clock in her head, the exact same clock that counted down her little brother Leo's life every single day. She couldn't let someone die tonight. Not tonight. Suddenly, the man's broad chest convulsed violently under her hands. He rolled to his side, aggressively coughing up a massive lungful of dark river water onto the stones. Maya fell back onto her hands, panting heavily, a wave of immense, staggering relief washing over her shaking body. He was alive. As he gasped desperately for air, his chest heaving, his large, blood-stained hand reached out blindly in the dark. His thick fingers clamped down hard on the collar of Maya's wet white shirt. His grip was astonishingly strong, desperate, like a man clinging to the edge of a cliff. Slowly, painfully, he forced his heavy eyelids open. Under the dim, flickering light, his eyes locked onto hers. They were a piercing, stormy grey. Currently, they were clouded with intense pain, confusion, and the lingering fog of near death, but they possessed a sharp, overwhelming intensity that made Maya completely freeze in place. He stared up at her face, taking in her wet, wild curls, her wide, terrified brown eyes, and the sheer exhaustion etched into her young features. He was burning her image deep into his fractured consciousness. Then a sound broke the intense, silent moment. Wee-oh! Police sirens wailed sharply in the distance, growing rapidly louder by the second. Red and blue lights began to bounce wildly off the concrete pillars of the bridge above them, cutting through the darkness. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced right through Maya's exhaustion. The police were coming. That meant questions, statements, paramedics, hours sitting in a brightly lit precinct while they verified her identity. She looked down at her cheap, waterlogged watch. She was already late for her critical shift at the diner. If she didn't show up, if she got fired tonight, Leo's hospital account would go into immediate default by Friday. She couldn't afford to be a hero on police paper. She simply couldn't afford the extreme luxury of involvement. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling violently from the cold and the fear. "I have to go." "They're coming to help you." She tried to pull away to stand up, but the man's bloody fingers were locked in an absolute death grip on the thin fabric of her shirt, right near her collarbone. He mumbled something unintelligible, a raspy sound from his bruised throat, his stormy grey eyes refusing to let her look away, refusing to let her leave. "Let go!" she panicked, her voice rising as she heard the loud screech of tyres pulling up on the bridge directly above them, followed by slamming car doors. With a desperate, forceful jerk fueled by pure adrenaline, Maya tore herself backward. Snap! The cheap plastic button of her only good work shirt tore away violently from the worn thread, popping off directly into the man's large palm. His heavy hand fell back to the wet stones, his fingers curling tightly around the small white button, as his eyes finally rolled back and he slipped back into the dark peace of unconsciousness. Maya didn't look back. Wrapping her arms tightly around her freezing body, her hair wild and her white shirt torn open at the collar, she scrambled desperately up the muddy, slippery bank and vanished completely into the unforgiving shadows of the Chicago night. The morning after the incident, the sprawling, glass-enclosed lobby of Vance Enterprises was a hive of frantic, hushed whispers. The golden morning light of Chicago poured through the 50-story atrium, but it did nothing to warm the chilling rumor circulating among the impeccably dressed employees. Julian Vance, the notoriously cold-blooded CEO who ruled the corporate empire with an iron fist, had narrowly escaped death in a supposed accident late last night. The official PR statement called it a misstep near the Riverwalk, but the nervous energy crackling through the building suggested everyone knew better. You didn't become a billionaire at 28 without making enemies who preferred you at the bottom of the river. Maya Jackson stood near the employee elevators, trying desperately to blend into the marble walls. She had survived her grueling night shift at the diner on pure adrenaline and 3 cups of black coffee, returning to her cramped apartment just long enough to shower and perform emergency surgery on her clothes. Her white dress shirt, the very same one she had worn into the freezing river, was now dry and pressed, but the collar bore a glaringly obvious flaw. Lacking matching thread, she had been forced to sew a spare, slightly larger button onto the collar, using a thick, off-white thread she found in a forgotten sewing kit. It looked awkward and clumsy against the crisp fabric, a neon sign of her impoverished reality amidst the sea of designer silk and tailored wool around her. Her immediate supervisor, Brenda Hayes, was already on a rampage. Brenda was a woman in her early 40s who compensated for her lack of genuine talent with sheer, terrifying micromanagement. She was tall, painfully thin, and always encased in rigid slate-grey suits that matched her personality. Brenda had climbed the middle management ladder by stepping squarely on the backs of interns, her bitter disposition born from years of being passed over for executive promotions. "Jackson, stop hovering like a lost pigeon," Brenda snapped, her sharp, angular features contorted in stress. "The executive board is terrified Mr. Vance is in the main conference room, and no one from catering wants to go near him. Take this coffee tray up to the penthouse level immediately. Do not speak, do not make eye contact, just pour and vanish. Understood?" Maya simply nodded, taking the heavy silver tray. Her muscles screamed in protest, still agonizingly sore from fighting the river's current. When the elevator doors chimed open on the 50th floor, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air felt 10 degrees colder. Maya approached the heavy oak doors of the boardroom and slipped inside. The sprawling room was immaculate, dominated by a massive mahogany table. Several high-ranking executives sat frozen in their leather chairs, sweating profusely despite the aggressive air conditioning. At the head of the table sat Julian Vance. He was a terrifying sight. The expensive tailored black suit he wore today could not hide the bulky white bandages wrapped tightly around his left forearm, peeking out from under his cuff. A small white adhesive bandage rested over his temple, covering the gash from the bridge. His stormy grey eyes were fixed on the VP of Operations, a balding, nervous man named Richard, who was currently stammering through a quarterly report. Julian's silence was a weapon, and he was wielding it with absolute, lethal precision. Maya kept her head down, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She moved like a ghost, pouring hot coffee into the porcelain cups with practiced, steady hands. She reached Julian's side. He didn't look at her, his gaze still pinning the sweating VP to his chair. Maya leaned over slightly to pour the dark liquid. As she did, the stiff cuff of her shirt pulled back just an inch. Suddenly Julian's hand shot out, his large, warm fingers clamped around Maya's delicate wrist like a steel vice. The entire boardroom instantly fell dead silent. Richard stopped talking mid-sentence. Brenda's warning echoed in Maya's head, but it was too late. Julian's piercing grey eyes snapped from the VP to the wrist he was holding. There, completely undeniable on Maya's dark skin, was a long, angry red scratch, the exact mark left by the jagged river rocks when she had hauled his unconscious body out of the water. Julian's gaze slowly trailed up her arm, moving past her trembling shoulders until it locked dead onto her collar. He stared intently at the clumsily sewn button with its thick, off-white thread. For a fraction of a second, the cold, impenetrable mask of the billionaire cracked, revealing a flash of absolute certainty. He looked into her wide, exhausted brown eyes, recognizing the fierce spark of the girl who had screamed at him to breathe in the dark. "Everyone out," Julian commanded. His voice was low, smooth, and completely devoid of room for negotiation. The executives scrambled. Chairs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, papers were hastily shoved into briefcases, and within 10 seconds, the massive boardroom was entirely empty, the heavy doors clicking shut behind the last fleeing suit. Julian released her wrist. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and slowly placed a small object onto the polished mahogany table. It was a cheap, white plastic button with a torn piece of fine white thread still clinging to it. Maya stared at the button, her breath catching in her throat. There was no point in denying it. "I remember the river," Julian said softly, leaning back in his chair, though his posture remained predatory. "I remember the cold. And I remember you." "I just did what anyone would do, Mr. Vance," Maya replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Though her hands were shaking so badly, she had to clasp them behind her back. "Hardly," Julian scoffed coldly. "Most people in this city would have pulled out their phones to record me drowning. You jumped in. You saved my life, miss." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Jackson. Maya Jackson. I'm a finance intern." "Miss Jackson." Julian steepled his fingers, his calculating mind already moving 10 steps ahead. "I'm not a man who believes in accidents. The man who pushed me last night knew my schedule. He bypassed my private security detail." "It means he had inside help. Someone within this very building is trying to kill me. and they will likely try again. Maya swallowed hard, taking a slight step back. I should get back to my desk, sir. I'm just an intern. Which makes you entirely invisible, Julian countered smoothly, standing up. He towered over her, his presence overwhelming. You blend into the background. People ignore interns. They talk over them. They leave documents unattended around them. I need eyes and ears on the lower floors. I need someone I can trust, and ironically, the only person in this entire empire I currently trust is the girl who risked her life for a complete stranger. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a dangerous conspiratorial murmur. Work for me directly, Miss Jackson. Be my shadow in the lower departments. Report anything unusual. In exchange, I will compensate you handsomely. A sum large enough to change your life completely. Maya's pride immediately flared. She wasn't a spy, and she deeply resented the implication that her bravery could be bought with a blank check. She opened her mouth to deliver a sharp refusal, to tell the billionaire to keep his dirty money and his corporate warfare to himself. But before the words could leave her lips, an image flashed in her mind. Leo, her little brother, lying in a sterile hospital bed, his chest rising and falling with agonizing weakness. The hospital billing department had called again yesterday. Time was running out. She didn't need pride, she needed a miracle, and right now the devil himself was offering her one. She looked Julian dead in the eye, her jaw setting with the same stubborn determination she had shown on the riverbank. Deal. Julian's lips twitched into the ghost of a smirk. Good. The transition back to reality was harsh. When Maya finally exited the boardroom, Brenda was waiting by the elevators, her face a mask of furious suspicion. Assuming Maya had done something clumsy to provoke the CEO into kicking the executives out, Brenda immediately decided to punish her. Since you clearly can't handle simple hospitality, Jackson, you can spend the rest of the week out of sight, Brenda sneered, shoving a ring of heavy brass keys into Maya's chest. Go down to the basement archives, sub-level 3. The old financial records from the past 5 years are a mess. Organize them chronologically. Don't come up until it's done. The basement was a stark contrast to the gleaming glass of the upper floors. It was a cavernous, windowless concrete bunker that smelled of stale paper, dust, and neglect. Flickering fluorescent lights cast long, eerie shadows over endless rows of towering metal filing cabinets. It was isolating, quiet work, but Maya welcomed the silence. It gave her time to process the insane deal she had just made. She rolled up her sleeves, ignoring the throbbing pain in her muscles, and began sorting through the heavy, dust-covered boxes. As a finance intern, she possessed a brilliant analytical mind for numbers, a talent entirely wasted on Brenda's coffee runs. 2 hours into the grueling task, Maya pulled a thick, leather-bound ledger from a box marked Confidential Q3 to Q4. She blew the dust off the cover and opened it. The pages were filled with complex budget allocations and offshore transfer logs. At the bottom of every single page was a flamboyant, jagged signature. Maya recognized the name instantly. Marcus Thorne. Marcus was the former chief financial officer of Vance Enterprises. He was a man Maya had only seen from afar, a slick, overly charismatic executive with perfectly styled hair, expensive cologne, and a predatory smile. He had been abruptly fired just 2 weeks ago under mysterious circumstances, a highly publicized scandal that the company had tried frantically to bury. Maya flipped through the pages, her eyes naturally tracking the columns of numbers. Suddenly she frowned. She ran her finger down a list of logistical expenditures. It didn't add up. She pulled a calculator from her pocket and ran the numbers again. Then she cross-referenced it with the vendor payment logs in the next folder. Her breath hitched. Millions of dollars were systematically unaccounted for, cleverly hidden behind phantom shell corporations and inflated invoice approvals. The discrepancies were masterfully disguised, buried so deep in corporate jargon that only a paranoid auditor or a brilliant, desperate intern would ever spot them. Every single fraudulent transfer was authorized by Marcus Thorne, and the dates of the largest missing sums aligned perfectly with the weeks leading up to Julian Vance's accident. Maya stared at the dusty files, the silence of the basement suddenly feeling incredibly dangerous. She wasn't just organizing papers anymore, she was holding the motive for murder. The newly forged alliance between the billionaire and the intern did not go unnoticed. Over the next few days, Maya's routine drastically shifted. Under the guise of delivering Brenda's endless menial reports, she made frequent, quiet trips to the 50th floor, slipping the copied ledger pages into Julian's hands. However, the Vance Enterprises building was a glass fortress, filled with ambitious predators, and secrets were a rare currency. Marcus Thorne, despite being unceremoniously exiled from the company, still had his venomous tentacles wrapped tightly around the lower floors. His primary eyes and ears came in the form of Derek Simmons, a junior accountant with slicked-back blonde hair, perpetually sweaty palms, and a weak, receding chin. Derek was a sycophant of the highest order, a man whose cowardice was only matched by his crippling gambling debts that Marcus had conveniently paid off in exchange for absolute loyalty. Derek had noticed the impoverished intern bypassing the standard chain of command, carrying heavily sealed folders directly to the executive suite. He immediately relayed this anomaly to his disgraced master. The retaliation was swift and deeply psychological. It started on a damp Tuesday morning. Maya trudged down to the employee locker room to stow her coat. When she opened her battered metal locker, her heart plummeted into her stomach. Stuck dead center on the inside of the door was a bright yellow sticky note. It was dripping with thick, viscous red ink that looked sickeningly like fresh blood, pooling at the bottom edge and staining the metal. The message was scrawled in jagged, hurried letters. "Keep your eyes on the coffee, little girl, or you might end up at the bottom of the river too." Maya gasped, instinctively looking over her shoulder, but the dingy locker room was entirely empty. A cold sweat broke out across her neck. She crumpled the note, her hands trembling uncontrollably, and shoved it deep into her pocket. She tried to convince herself it was merely a cruel prank, but the terror was visceral. The true magnitude of the danger she was in finally crystallized that evening. After clocking out from her grueling internship, Maya headed to the dark subterranean parking garage where she chained her rusty second-hand bicycle. It was her only mode of transportation, a lifeline between the towering skyscrapers and her miserable neighborhood. But as she approached the bike rack, a stifled sob escaped her lips. The bicycle had been brutalized. Both tires were viciously slashed, the rubber shredded and hanging off the metal rims like dead skin. The spokes were bent, and the chain had been completely severed. She stood alone in the dimly lit garage, staring at the ruined metal, the crushing weight of her reality finally breaking her composure. A single tear tracked down her cheek. She had no money for the bus, let alone a cab, and walking back to the south side at this hour was a death sentence. Suddenly the blinding glare of halogen headlights washed over her. A massive, jet-black, armored SUV pulled up silently beside her, its sleek exterior reflecting the harsh garage lights. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Thomas. Thomas was Julian's personal driver and head of security, a man in his late 50s, built like a solid brick wall, wearing an impeccably tailored dark suit. He had short, military-cropped grey hair, and a prominent jagged scar cutting directly through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a past life he never discussed. Thomas was fiercely loyal, possessing a silent, intimidating demeanor, but his eyes held a surprising paternal warmth as he looked at the shivering girl. He opened the heavy, bulletproof rear door of the SUV without a word, gesturing for her to step inside. Maya hesitated, but the exhaustion in her bones won. She climbed into the plush, leather-scented cavern of the back seat. Julian Vance was already sitting there, illuminated only by the soft blue glow of a tablet resting on his lap. He looked up, his stormy grey eyes immediately locking onto her tear-streaked face. He didn't ask what happened. Thomas had already briefed him via earpiece. The SUV glided smoothly out of the garage, leaving the wreckage of her bicycle behind. As the sleek vehicle navigated away from the glittering downtown skyline and entered the desolate, crumbling streets of Maya's neighborhood, the stark contrast between their two worlds became suffocatingly apparent. The SUV finally rolled to a stop outside a dilapidated apartment building, its brick facade scarred by graffiti and neglect. As if on cue, a creature emerged from the shadows of the alleyway. It was Barnaby, a scrappy, one-eared orange tabby cat who belonged to no one but tolerated Maya. Barnaby was skin and bones, his fur matted with city grime, a true survivor of the unforgiving streets. He let out a raspy meow, rubbing his emaciated body against the heavy tires of the $1 million vehicle, waiting for the meager scraps Maya usually brought him. Julian looked through the tinted, bulletproof glass at the crumbling building, the flickering street lamp, and the starving cat. For the first time since Maya had met him, the impenetrable, icy armor surrounding the CEO seemed to fracture. The cold calculation in his gaze softened into something profoundly melancholic. He turned to her, the silence in the luxurious cabin heavy with unspoken truths. "Marcus wasn't just my chief financial officer," Julian began, his voice barely more than a rough whisper, devoid of its usual commanding edge. "He was my mentor. When my father died, Marcus was the one who guided me through the board's political minefields. I trusted him implicitly. I looked at him as the closest thing I had left to family, to realize that the man who taught me how to swim was the same man paying someone to drown me. It is a unique kind of poison." Maya looked at him, truly seeing the man beneath the bespoke suit. Beneath the billions, Julian Vance was entirely, devastatingly alone. "I know about family," Maya murmured, looking down at her worn hands. The dam inside her finally broke, and she found herself pouring out her soul to the most powerful man in Chicago. She told him about Leo. She described her 10-year-old brother's infectious, gap-toothed smile, his obsession with comic books, and the cruel, deteriorating heart defect that was slowly stealing his life. She spoke of the crushing medical bills, the endless night shifts, and the terrifying, suffocating fear of waking up to an empty bed. In the quiet intimacy of the armored SUV, two vastly different worlds collided. They were two intensely lonely souls, separated by unimaginable wealth and status, yet bound together by a profound sense of isolation and betrayal. For a fleeting moment, Julian wasn't a ruthless billionaire, and Maya wasn't a desperate intern. They were just two people fighting to survive the darkness. But the darkness rarely grants a reprieve. The next afternoon, the fragile bubble of resilience Maya had built was shattered completely. She was at her desk, organizing a stack of memos when her cheap cell phone buzzed. It was Dr. Evans from the cardiology wing. The words blurred together in a devastating rush of medical terminology, but the bottom line was a brutal death sentence. Leo's condition had acutely worsened overnight. He needed the valve replacement surgery within the next 48 hours, but the hospital administration, bound by unyielding bureaucratic policies, refused to schedule the operating room without a massive upfront cash deposit, a deposit Maya couldn't even begin to afford if she worked for the next 20 years. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering onto the desk. The bustling noise of the corporate floor faded into a muted, ringing drone. Suffocating panic clawed at her throat. She stood up on unsteady legs, abandoning her desk, and sprinted down the corridor, pushing past annoyed executives until she reached the women's restroom. She locked herself in the handicap stall, her back sliding down the cold tiled wall until she hit the floor. She clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle the agonizing, gut-wrenching sobs that tore through her chest. It was the absolute total collapse of a girl who had fought too hard for too long, finally crushed by a universe that refused to show mercy. What Maya didn't know was that the Vance Enterprises security protocol mandated surveillance cameras in the vanity areas of all restrooms to prevent corporate espionage. 50 floors above, inside his private, secure monitoring room, Julian Vance stood frozen before a wall of glowing screens. His eyes were fixed on camera feed 4B, watching the young woman who had bravely pulled him from the freezing depths of the Chicago River, now drowning in her own sea of despair. He watched her hyperventilating against the bathroom tiles, her face buried in her hands. The room was dead silent, save for the hum of the servers. Julian's jaw tightened, tight enough to crack his teeth. Slowly, deliberately, his large hand balled into a tight, white-knuckled fist upon the control console. The coldness returned to his eyes, but this time it wasn't directed at the world. It was a lethal, focused rage directed entirely at the circumstances trying to destroy the only light he had found in the dark. The sheer, unadulterated rage Julian felt watching Maya collapse in the restroom catalyzed a cold, terrifying clarity within him. He was an apex predator of the corporate boardroom, and Marcus Thorne had foolishly forgotten how lethal his former protégé could be. First, Julian handled the immediate, bleeding crisis. Sitting at his massive mahogany desk, his face a mask of stone, he made a single, untraceable phone call to the chief financial administrator of Chicago Memorial Hospital. Within 3 minutes, an astronomical wire transfer was authorized through a highly secured shell charity foundation Julian maintained for anonymous philanthropy. The entire crippling cost of Leo Jackson's heart surgery, plus an extra year of premium post-operative care, was paid in full under the strict, non-negotiable condition of absolute anonymity. Down on the intern floor, Maya was staring blankly at her computer screen, her mind drowning in despair, when her cheap cell phone rang again. It was Dr. Arthur Evans. Dr. Evans was a pediatric cardiologist in his late 50s, a man with kind, chronically tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a neatly trimmed salt-and-pepper beard. His voice, usually heavy with the grim realities of his pediatric ward, was uncharacteristically light and breathless. "Maya, I don't know who your guardian angel is," Dr. Evans said, the relief palpable through the static of the receiver. "But a private charity foundation just cleared Leo's entire balance, every single cent. We are prepping him for immediate surgery tonight." Maya dropped the phone, covering her mouth as tears of sheer, disbelief-fueled joy streamed down her face. A miraculous, suffocating weight vanished from her shoulders, leaving her gasping for air. She didn't know how it happened, but for the first time in years she felt a glimmer of hope. With Maya's brother finally safe, Julian turned his entire, terrifying focus toward the extermination of Marcus Thorne. He knew Marcus was desperate, cornered, and obsessively monitoring the situation through his mole. Julian needed the perfect bait to draw the rat out of the walls. He summoned Derek Simmons, the sweaty, spineless junior accountant spying for Marcus, to his executive office under the guise of a routine security audit. During the brief meeting, Julian deliberately left a highly sensitive, forged memo open on his computer monitor, then excused himself to take a private call. The memo explicitly stated that intern Maya Jackson had successfully decrypted the master USB drive containing Marcus Thorne's entire black ledger, offshore accounts, embezzlement trails, and fraudulent signatures. Furthermore, the memo detailed that Maya was instructed to remain entirely alone on the 50th floor tonight to finalize the physical printouts before handing them directly over to the FBI at dawn. Predictably, the moment Julian stepped out, Derek's trembling fingers snapped a quick photo of the document on his phone and sent it to Marcus. The trap was perfectly set. Julian knew Marcus wouldn't run. The man's narcissistic arrogance and sheer desperation to protect his stolen wealth would compel him to eliminate the threat and retrieve the drive himself. At 7 p.m., the towering glass monolith of Vance Enterprises rapidly emptied as the standard workday concluded. The bustling floors fell completely silent. Julian called Maya into his executive suite. The sprawling, opulent office was bathed in the dim, golden light of the setting Chicago sun. Maya stood before his desk, still wearing her worn, threadbare white shirt with the mismatched button, her posture rigid with nervous anticipation. Julian reached into his heavy desk drawer and produced a sleek, matte, black gift box, sliding it smoothly across the polished wood toward her. "Open it," he commanded gently, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Inside, resting perfectly on dark tissue paper, was a brand-new designer white silk button-down shirt. It was flawless, elegant, and cut to fit her perfectly. Beneath the soft, luxurious fabric lay something starkly different, a small, highly tactical black dagger with a textured grip, its cold steel blade gleaming menacingly in the dim light. Maya looked up, her brown eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Mr. Vance? What is this?" Julian rounded the desk, stopping just inches from her. The towering billionaire looked down at the fierce, impoverished intern who had pulled him from a watery grave. His stormy grey eyes were remarkably vulnerable, completely devoid of their usual corporate frost. "Marcus took the bait," Julian explained, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. "He is coming here tonight for a USB drive that doesn't actually exist. Security is completely pulled back from this floor to give him a false sense of confidence, but I will be monitoring every single square inch from the hidden security annex behind this office. You will not be alone. However, I want you to have that blade just in case." He reached out, his large, warm hand lightly brushing against the frayed, cheap collar of her old shirt, his touch sending an unexpected jolt through her spine. "Put the new shirt on, Maya. You are walking into a battlefield tonight, and you should be armored appropriately. Don't be afraid. I swear to you, I will not let you experience drowning in that freezing river again." The hours dragged on with agonizing slowness. By midnight, the 50th floor of Vance Enterprises was a desolate, chilling landscape of glass and steel. Maya sat alone at the central administrative desk, wearing the luxurious new silk shirt. The fabric felt impossibly soft against her skin, a stark, surreal contrast to the cold, heavy dagger she had concealed against her lower back, tucked securely into her waistband. The silence of the skyscraper was absolute, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clatter of her fingers, typing mindlessly on the keyboard to keep up the charade. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering Chicago skyline seemed a million miles away. She was a solitary speck, suspended high in the sky, dangling freely as live bait for a murderer. Her heart hammered a relentless rhythm against her ribs, mirroring the ticking digital clock on her monitor. 12:15 a.m., 12:30 a.m. At exactly 1 a.m., the atmosphere on the floor shifted violently. With a heavy, echoing thunk that reverberated deeply through the concrete subfloors, the main power grid to the top executive levels was brutally severed. The bright overhead fluorescent lights instantly died, plunging the sprawling floor into pitch-black darkness. A second later, the pale, eerie red glow of the emergency exit signs flickered to life, casting long, bloody, distorted shadows across the carpet. Maya's breath hitched sharply in her throat. Her fingers froze perfectly still over the keyboard. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and terrifyingly alive. From the far end of the long corridor, the electronic lock on the heavy glass boardroom doors disengaged with a soft click, manually bypassed by someone who intimately knew the building's override codes. The thick glass doors were slowly, deliberately pushed open, the metal hinges whining softly in the dead air. Out of the murky crimson shadows stepped Marcus Thorne. He was a man in his late 40s who had once possessed a slick, terrifyingly charismatic aura, accustomed to wearing bespoke suits with careless arrogance, his silver fox hair perfectly styled. But tonight the polish was completely gone. He looked unhinged, his tie loosened, his expensive jacket wrinkled, his eyes wild and sunken with the feral, dangerous desperation of a cornered predator. The dim red emergency light caught the cruel metallic glint of a large hunting knife gripped tightly in his hand. As his manic eyes locked onto Maya, sitting alone in the gloom, his lips curled upwards, stretching his face into a slow, twisted, deeply terrifying smile. The oppressive silence of the severed power grid pressed down on the 50th floor of Vance Enterprises like a physical weight. Marcus Thorne advanced slowly, his expensive Italian leather shoes crunching softly against the plush corporate carpet. The pale, blood-red glow of the emergency exit signs cast grotesque, elongated shadows across his face, highlighting the manic twitch in his jaw. Maya stumbled backward, her pulse roaring in her ears, until her spine hit the freezing, floor-to-ceiling glass window. Below her, the glittering expanse of Chicago stretched out like a diamond-studded blanket, completely oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in the sky. "Give me the drive, you miserable little rat!" Marcus spat, his voice a venomous hiss that echoed in the cavernous, darkened office. He dragged the tip of his hunting knife along the edge of a mahogany desk, the screeching of metal on wood, sending agonizing shivers down Maya's spine. "You really thought you could outsmart me, a ghetto intern with a patched-up shirt?" Maya slipped her hand behind her back, her trembling fingers wrapping around the textured grip of the tactical dagger Julian had given her. She didn't have a USB drive, of course, but she had to keep him talking. She had to buy Julian the perfect audio recording. "You killed him," Maya stammered, projecting her voice as loudly as she dared, hoping the hidden microphones in Julian's annex were picking up every single syllable. "You pushed Mr. Vance off that bridge." Marcus threw his head back and laughed, a hollow, scraping sound completely devoid of sanity. He stopped 3 feet from her, casually tossing the heavy blade from hand to hand. "He was weak," Marcus snarled, his arrogance blinding him to the absolute peril he was in. "I built the financial infrastructure of this empire. Julian's father knew my worth, but the boy wanted audits. He wanted transparency. You don't make billions with clean hands, sweet Maya." I diverted 50 million through offshore shells over 3 years, right under his aristocratic nose. Pushing him into that freezing river was the easiest business decision I ever made. He took another step forward, the knife catching the faint moonlight slicing through the glass. I cut the main fiber optic line in the basement, sweetie. No cameras, no security alarms. It's just you, me, and a tragic robbery gone entirely wrong. He lunged. The movement was explosive, fueled by pure, desperate malice. Maya ripped the dagger from her waistband, bracing herself for the impact, but she never got the chance to use it. A massive silhouette erupted from the pitch-black void of the executive corridor. Julian Vance didn't just intervene, he collided with Marcus like a runaway freight train. The impact sent a sickening crunch echoing through the room. Julian violently shoved Maya to the side, throwing his own broad body between her and the swinging blade. Maya screamed as she heard the distinct, horrifying sound of tearing fabric and slicing flesh. The hunting knife carved a vicious, jagged path across Julian's left shoulder, bypassing his tailored suit jacket and biting deep into the muscle. A sharp grunt escaped Julian's lips, but the pain only seemed to fuel his immense, terrifying rage. Ignoring the blood rapidly blossoming across his white shirt, Julian clamped his massive hand around Marcus's wrist, twisting it with brutal, mechanical efficiency until the bones snapped audibly. Marcus shrieked in agony, dropping the knife to the carpet. Julian didn't stop. He drove his knee squarely into Marcus's abdomen, sending the disgraced executive crashing into a glass partition, shattering it into 1,000 glittering pieces. Before Marcus could even attempt to recover, Julian was on top of him, his forearm pressed securely against Marcus's windpipe, pinning him to the floor with lethal, unyielding force. Suddenly, the 50th floor erupted into blinding, localized daylight. Julian's hidden tactical team had manually overridden the breaker. A swarm of heavily armed police officers and Vance Enterprise security personnel flooded the floor from the emergency stairwells, their tactical boots thundering against the floorboards. Leading the charge was Detective Sarah Reynolds. Reynolds was a hardened veteran of the Chicago Police Department's Major Crimes Division, a solidly built woman in her late 40s with tightly braided dark hair, piercing hazel eyes, and a no-nonsense demeanor forged by decades of dealing with the city's worst scum. She possessed a sharp, analytical mind and absolutely zero tolerance for corporate entitlement. "Secure the suspect!" Reynolds barked, her voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. "Read him his rights and get that knife bagged for evidence. We have the full audio confession recorded directly from Mr. Vance's secure server." Officers aggressively hauled a hyperventilating, weeping Marcus to his feet, slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. "This is a setup! You framed me!" Marcus screamed, blood and spit flying from his mouth as they dragged him roughly toward the freight elevator. His expensive suit was ruined, his dignity annihilated, his legacy reduced to the desperate ravings of a court felon. Julian slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his breathing ragged and heavy. He ignored the frantic paramedics rushing toward him, his stormy grey eyes searching the chaotic room until they locked onto Maya. She was still pressed against the glass wall, completely paralyzed by shock, her hands trembling violently. Julian crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't say a word. He just pulled her into his chest, wrapping his strong, uninjured arm tightly around her trembling frame. Maya gasped, burying her face into his chest. The metallic, coppery scent of fresh blood mingled intoxicatingly with the rich, masculine scent of his expensive cedarwood and bergamot cologne. He held her with a fierce, possessive desperation, his large hand gently stroking her unruly dark curls. "Are you hurt?" Julian whispered harshly. pulling back just enough to frantically inspect her face, his thumb lightly brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "Did he touch you?" Maya shook her head, unable to find her voice. Her heart was hammering a chaotic, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She couldn't tell if it was the fading adrenaline of the near-death experience, or the overwhelming, intoxicating proximity of the cold CEO looking at her with such raw, unfiltered, agonizingly gentle concern. In that chaotic, blood-stained room, surrounded by police and shattered glass, the invisible, impenetrable wall between their two vastly different worlds completely crumbled. Julian's icy exterior was entirely gone, replaced by the warmth of a man who had finally found something worth protecting more than his empire. "We got him, Mr. Vance," Detective Reynolds said softly, stepping up beside them, her tone unusually respectful. "He's going away for the rest of his life. You need to let the medics look at that shoulder." Before Julian could respond, the sharp, shrill ringing of a cell phone pierced the intimate moment. Maya jumped, reaching into the pocket of her slacks with shaking hands. The caller ID flashed Dr. Evans's name. She swiped the screen, putting the phone to her ear, her breath catching in her throat. "Maya," Dr. Evans's voice drifted through the speaker, sounding utterly exhausted but profoundly joyful, the background noise of hospital monitors beeping steadily. "I wanted to call you the exact second we closed him up. The valve replacement was a complete success. His vitals are incredibly strong. Leo is going to be perfectly fine, Maya. That anonymous charity fund. It saved his life today." A fresh wave of tears cascaded down Maya's face, but this time they were tears of absolute, unadulterated salvation. She lowered the phone, looking up into Julian's stormy grey eyes. The realization crashed over her with staggering force. While the police sirens wailed into the Chicago night outside, Maya stared at the bleeding billionaire holding her, finally understanding exactly who her anonymous guardian angel was. Exactly 1 month had passed since the violent, blood-stained confrontation on the 50th floor, and the bitter, biting chill of the Chicago winter had officially settled over the city. The towering skyline remained unchanged, but the corporate landscape within Vance Enterprises had undergone a seismic, ruthless purification. Marcus Thorne was currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding cell, stripped of his bespoke suits and his arrogant smirk, anxiously awaiting a highly publicized trial that promised to lock him away for the rest of his natural life. With the cancerous corruption surgically removed from the executive board, Vance Enterprises had not only weathered the devastating PR storm, but had rebounded with terrifying, unprecedented market strength. Julian Vance had returned to the helm of his empire, his left shoulder fully healed, his reputation as an untouchable, brilliant apex predator completely solidified in the financial world. Yet for Maya Jackson, the most profound shift had not occurred in the stock market, but within the sterile, brightly lit corridors of Chicago Memorial Hospital. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when the final, invisible piece of the puzzle accidentally fell into place. Maya was sitting by her brother's bedside, watching with profound, overwhelming gratitude as a healthy flush of color bloomed in 10-year-old Leo's cheeks. He was sitting up, animatedly reading a comic book, his heart finally beating with a strong, steady, unburdened rhythm. The door to the recovery suite swung open, and Dr. Miriam Hayes strode into the room. Dr. Hayes was the chief of surgery who had personally performed Leo's operation. She was a formidable, highly intimidating woman in her late 50s, possessing razor-sharp cheekbones, a severe asymmetrical silver bob, and an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. She was tall, impossibly rigid in her posture, and was notoriously known to make junior medical residents cry with a single, deeply unimpressed arched eyebrow. However, beneath her icy, demanding exterior beat a fiercely dedicated heart. A tragic loss of her own child decades ago had driven her to become the most relentless, brilliant pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon in the entire Midwest. She rarely smiled, but as she checked Leo's charting monitor, a faint, genuine look of satisfaction softened her sharp features. "His vitals are pristine, Maya," Dr. Hayes murmured, aggressively scribbling on her clipboard. "He will be discharged by Friday. You should be exceptionally proud. And frankly, you should send another thank you card to Julian Vance's private office. His foundation just cleared the final administrative fees for the outpatient physical therapy this morning without batting an eye. Usually, billionaire donors drag their feet on the post-op care." Dr. Hayes froze, her pen halting abruptly on the paper as she realized her fatal, accidental breach of confidentiality. She looked up, her usually piercing eyes widening slightly as she saw the sheer, unadulterated shock wash over Maya's face. The revelation hit Maya like a physical blow to the chest, stealing the air directly from her lungs. Julian! It had been Julian all along. The untouchable, cold-blooded CEO hadn't just saved her from a knife-wielding maniac, he had secretly reached down into the darkest, most desperate abyss of her life and pulled her entirely family into the light. An immense, crushing wave of gratitude threatened to bring her to her knees, but simultaneously a cold, heavy realization settled deep into her bones. An invisible, insurmountable wall of debt and power dynamics had instantly materialized between them. How could she ever look at him as an equal when she owed him the very breath in her brother's lungs? She realized with a painful, aching clarity just how fragile and deeply vulnerable her existence was compared to the monolithic, untouchable world he commanded. Julian Vance fell completely, devastatingly silent. For a long, agonizing moment, the heavy air in the office stood completely still. A flash of sharp, unmistakable disappointment swept through the stormy depths of his grey eyes, the pain of rejection briefly fracturing his composed exterior. But as he looked at the young woman standing fiercely before him, no longer a shivering, terrified girl in a wet shirt, but a proud, unyielding force of nature, the disappointment was rapidly, undeniably replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of respect. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who would have killed for a fraction of the wealth and protection he had just offered her. He had mistakenly thought he was the seasoned hunter swooping in to rescue the helpless prey. But he realized now, looking at the fire in Maya's eyes, that the girl with the neatly bunned hair and the cheap thrift store blazer was not a fragile sparrow at all. She was a magnificent eagle standing at the edge of a vast cliff, simply waiting for the exact right moment to spread her own wings and soar. Slowly Julian reached out and picked up the red velvet box. The sharp, corporate edge returned to his posture, but the harshness was entirely gone, leaving only a calm, deeply admiring patience. He opened his top desk drawer and carefully, deliberately placed the velvet box inside, closing it with a soft click. "I will keep it safely in here," Julian said, his deep voice returning to its smooth, commanding cadence, though the very corner of his mouth twitched upward into a rare, breathtakingly genuine smile. "I will hold on to it until you are completely ready to take it back." He leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms over his chest as he looked at her with pure, unadulterated professional respect. "Welcome to the executive team of Vance Enterprises, Ms. Jackson. Now please, take your desk and show me exactly how high you can fly." Maya's smile widened, radiating a brilliant, triumphant warmth that seemed to illuminate the entire room. She gave him a firm, respectful nod, turned on her heel, and walked purposefully toward the heavy oak doors. As she stepped out of the office, she glanced through the towering glass windows. The bright, glittering afternoon sun of Chicago was reflecting beautifully off the surface of the river below, the very same river that had once been a freezing, dark abyss of death, now sparkling with endless, vibrant possibility. She did not know if their paths would eventually intertwine into a romantic future, or if their two worlds would ever truly align. But as she walked down the corridor, her sensible shoes clicking confidently against the marble floor, Maya Jackson knew one thing with absolute, undeniable certainty. She was finally walking entirely on her own 2 feet. True salvation had not come from a billionaire's bank account, but from the relentless, unconquerable strength she had found within her own soul. Their story was far from over. It was simply waiting for a much more equal, spectacular beginning.